There's a whip. There's a way.
Ever since Indiana Jones, and probably before, people found fighting whips really cool. And of course, swords are cool. So if you combine the two, that's even cooler, isn't it? So are there any reasons why we don't have those in real life? Plenty. The most iconic example of the whip sword, or snake sword in that case, is of course Ivy from Soul Calibur. Most iconic for very obvious reasons. Before that, Jeanne d'Arc in World Heroes had a very similar looking whip sword. There's also whip sword in Aria of Sorrow, which I really like. You know, the way it's animated and the way it works, it's got so much reach. It's a really cool weapon to use. I can definitely see the popularity of this concept. And then there's also the threaded cane in Bloodborne. Those are just a couple of examples. This sort of weapon appears every now and then in different settings. So personally, I've always loved the Castlevania games, the 2D ones that is. If it's 3D, it's not Castlevania in my book. I'm just biased like that. And of course, the whip is very iconic, the vampire killer. You know, be it the leather version that Simon Belmont in Super Castlevania 4, for example, has before he upgrades to the chain whip, or you know, various iterations of the chain whip. Some have like a Morning Star looking thing at the end, some just have a round ball, and so these are pretty cool. Not the most practical thing in real life. I mean, a bullwhip will hurt a lot. You know, if you've ever tried whip cracking, which I dabbled a little bit with, if you ever smack yourself unintentionally, yeah, it hurts quite a bit. And if you wanted to, if you really struck somebody as hard as you could do some damage. Lethal damage, I don't think so, unless it's repeated hits over and over again to vital areas like the spine or the head. That will be a different story, but otherwise these are not really lethal weapons. So what if you put blades on them? So then you have a sword on the one hand, which you can use as such, but you can also disconnect the blade segments and extend a cable or rope of some sort that turns this into a whip. And is there anything like this in real life? No. The closest thing would be the Indian Urumi, and I'll talk about that a bit later. The problem with segments, of course, is it weakens the integrity of the blade dramatically. It's basically like having a pre-broken blade to try to fight with, and you have to somehow keep it together. Let's ignore the obvious generic placeholder explanation of it's magic, duh, and think, you know, could you make this work mechanically somehow or by some other means? Well, the problem, if it had to be mechanical, is if you have, say, a steel cable running through that connects the segments, and the segments are all fitted perfectly so they kind of slide into one another. And then if you had some kind of mechanism in the grip or the pommel that winds this up, maybe winds the cable around, some sort of mechanism that pulls it tight, and as it pulls it tight, it aligns all the segments and they fit together. And then if there's enough tension on that cable, maybe it could be halfway usable. Now you would need a lot of tension on that to, you know, exert enough pressure that the segments actually stay together and that you can strike with it without the segments just popping off or shifting or otherwise messing up what you're trying to do when it's in its rigid configuration. And that, as a mechanical solution, I don't think that would work terribly well, because you have, you know, looking at how long that rope or cable is, you would have to cram all that into the handle without making the handle excessively bulky. You wouldn't want just like a crank on the pommel that you have to use every time you want to put it into its rigid configuration. So it would have to be something, I suppose, battery powered maybe, which means then you would have to have a battery in there. I guess maybe the pommel could be the battery, it could be a battery inside, and then maybe the winding mechanism in the handle. It would probably make the handle bulkier either way, and also it would make the entire thing heavier than it would otherwise be. And it probably wouldn't be terribly fast. Even if you had like some sort of electrical motor, it would still probably be like zzz, as opposed to click. So what about a high-tech solution? There are certain materials that can change their properties, like strength, hardness, flexibility, that sort of thing. For example, there are carbon nanotubes that become more rigid as they heat up. I don't think that would be an option here necessarily. There's also stuff like aerogel that expands 220% of its original size in milliseconds when there's an electrical charge applied to it. And I also read about a new material being researched that is basically a porous nanostructured metal bonded with a conductive fluid. So then if you run an electrical charge through it, it will become a lot more rigid. And stuff like that could potentially work if there's something that you can turn from a flexible material to a very hard material, and ideally also something that shrinks. Because as said, you will want to have the pretty long cable or rope or something that then shortens and hardens into a blade. So maybe someday materials will be available that would technically allow you to do that. It would still be pretty challenging because you would have to get the composition just right and the length and measurements, everything just perfect so that it shrinks enough that you don't have any gaps between the segments, and that it's just the perfect amount of tension so it doesn't fall apart, etc. So it seems extremely challenging. It's not really possible currently. There are some wall hanger things that look very similar to a whip sword, but those just are like that. They're just in the flexible state. You cannot make them rigid and make them fit perfectly and use them as a blade. So let's assume it was possible and you had a whip sword somehow. How would that benefit you? Or would it, compared to a regular sword? So you would have the reach, of course. It would be suddenly dramatically longer, and it would be less predictable because you could potentially whip around an opponent's defense. If the opponent parries with, say, a rigid blade, and you're close enough for this to hit and to whip around and hit them past their defense, that could work. And you could also potentially entangle the opponent's weapon and manipulate that. There are some cons to that, however. So for one, let's compare a very flexible material, and just length of chain here. Compare that to a steel ball at the end of the chain, a Morning Star, or some kind of thing like that. So these are very different. The whip sword would be closer to this than to that, because in this case you have a massive weight at the end of the chain, whereas with a whip sword you would have all the segments distributing the weight pretty evenly throughout. So a weapon like this would be most effective if you hit with the weighted end, obviously, and ideally but pretty close to the end of the chain. This way, this would hit the hardest, and it transfers all the momentum, all the force from the moving ball or whatever it is onto the body. If it's closer than that, it can still do some damage, not quite as much, because let's imagine it hits something here. So then the chain wraps around. This is already where this starts to lose velocity. And it keeps wrapping around, then it may hit at the end. So this won't hit quite as hard. If I have a fully flexible chain where the mass is distributed evenly, this doesn't hurt me at all. So I can whip this around my arm, I don't care. If I whip this around my torso, the final link is what wraps around and hits me on the side. Where the entire chain connects, I barely feel that. It's really just this part because it concentrates the force on this one small piece as opposed to over the entire length of the chain. This would be dramatically worse because of the way the mass is just distributed. So like I mentioned earlier, the closest thing to a whip sword would be the Indian Urumi, which is a very thin, long strip of metal, a blade if you want to call it that that is being used very much like a whip because it doesn't have the rigidity to be used as a sword. Some of them even have multiple blades. And so this is a weapon that is considered to be extremely dangerous to the user for obvious reasons. Just like with a chain, if you whip it around, you don't know what you're doing, you're going to whip yourself in the back or on the arms and the legs, etc. And it wouldn't be pleasant. So sometimes it's called the most dangerous sword. I'm assuming that is because of the danger it poses to the user. I haven't seen any actual tests. Well, actually there's one video on YouTube where somebody tests it. You couldn't really tell a whole lot. It didn't do a whole lot of damage, but it also wasn't really the right kind of target for that test. So it's hard to say. And I've only seen rehearsed demonstrations, where two martial artists go through certain movements where they just, whip and then parry with a shield and counter whip. So obviously no actual sparring because that would be dangerous, but no tests on any flesh analogs or anything like that. So it's hard to say exactly how effective they are. I couldn't find anything about whether they were actually used in war and what any records of the injuries that the sort of thing caused. If somebody has anything, let us know in the comments. I can imagine something like this with a relatively thin metal blade. I don't know whether they were sharpened or not, but even if it's not, it's probably thin enough that it would cut into flesh. I'm pretty sure they can. Even though you probably don't really have much control over the edge alignment. The way it moves, I think this would be relatively random at what angle you hit. If you hit directly with the edge on, or if it's partial flat, you just cannot control it as well during movement. Now, I said that as somebody who hasn't used one of these, so it's speculation, just saying that based on the design. Either way, what's the worst that could happen? It could possibly cut to the bone, I think. Once it hits the bone, there's no way it can get through. It's too flexible for that. What's the worst that can happen when you're hit with a sword? The limb comes off. Swords can cut through bone, they can cut into skulls, they can do all kinds of devastating things. A flexible, whip-like, quote-unquote sword couldn't get through bone. Even though, as I said, getting hit by an Urumi would definitely be an unpleasant, nasty experience, and it would definitely cause some damage. So what about trapping and entangling an opponent's sword? Let's say this comes around, and whipping this around the blade is not terribly easy. So let's say this comes around. This would just slide off because it's a smooth chain on a smooth blade, but with the whip sword you would have the segments that would probably entangle a lot better. So let's say the opponent has their whip sword wrapped around my sword, and now they pull on it. And I'm like, okay, fine, here, have it. You see the problem? This wouldn't actually stop me from continuing to use the sword in a thrust. I couldn't cut with it anymore as long as they hold on to it, but they can't really stop a thrust. They can pull on it, but they couldn't push very well. So this could still get you nailed. And the other thing is, even if the sword was disabled by something wrapping around it, guess what else is disabled? The whip sword. You can't use that anymore either. So you would need another weapon to follow up with. Trying to get the opponent's weapon entangled and controlling it can be a viable option as long as you have something else to follow up with, and also as long as you're stronger than the opponent. Because if you try to wrap something around the opponent's weapon and it turns out they can pull harder than you can, then guess what? They control you rather than vice versa. The other problem is the amount of skill it requires. You would have to practice a lot to become efficient with it, or even just get to the point where you don't hurt yourself anymore. The Chinese steel whip, or I think it's called a 7-sectional whip, I may be misremembering. That's an example of a weapon like that. Flexible weapons require a whole lot of practice. To put it in RPG terms, the time you need to invest into getting level 1 whip sword would probably get you level 3 with a conventional sword. So if it was possible to make whip swords, having one would of course make you look really cool and unique. Would that win you anything other than hipster contests? Good question. I have my doubts about that. I mean, in its flexible whip configuration, it doesn't really give you much of an advantage other than reach and it being confusing to the opponent, potentially. The entangling weapons could work either in your or in your opponent's favor, and otherwise you can thrust with it, of course, you can parry with it, and it's got a number of challenges when using it. When you put it in the rigid configuration, it's just like a regular sword. Well, probably not. It's never going to be quite as structurally sound as a real sword, no matter what you do. And it's always going to be somewhat heavier and somewhat more awkward than a standard sword. And finally, for amusement, I also wanted to point out the whip sword in Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. This one looks really cool. It's a nice animation, but it's, in practical terms, bullshit, frankly. I mean, it's a thrust with a flexible thing. He just makes it shoot out and it retracts. And have you ever tried stabbing somebody with a cooked spaghetti? It's not going to work. I suppose you could put a blade or some kind of projectile on a chain, connect the end of the chain to the muzzle of a shotgun, load that blade into a shotgun and fire it from it, and then retract it afterward, load it again, and so on until you've destroyed your bore because you're shooting hardened steel through it, and that's not really good. So yeah, I hope you found this entertaining. That was the idea. This is not exactly useful information that you use for the rest of your life in all kinds of different venues. Anyway, thanks for watching and have a good one, folks. Also check out the video description for relevant links and my Patreon page and all that good stuff.